His name was Sabalak Zamarashka. He herded herds, slept in other people's yurts, and hid from enemies near Kazan, and then he went out to fight. He killed the Kalmyk hero, and the whole steppe bowed before his name. He became a sultan, then a khan, and then a legend. An orphan in childhood, in maturity the ruler of 3 Juzes, he was feared by empires and respected by beytirs. This is the story of Abylai Khan, a man who survived where others wouldn't have had a chance. Welcome to the Amazing History channel, where we don't just talk about great people, but about how their destinies intertwined with the destinies of nations. Today, we're traveling back to the 18th century, the height of the steppe turmoil. If you're interested in history, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. The early 18th century was among the most turbulent periods in Kazakh steppe history. It seemed that the Khanate still existed, but the former unity was gone. In fact, it had split into 3 Juzes, the junior, the middle, and the senior. Each acted independently, but conflicts between them arose more and more often. However, external threats made the situation even worse. From the east, the Dzungar-Chinese, a powerful nomadic state with an army, discipline, and its own artillery, was advancing on Kazakh lands. The Dzungars were occupying more and more territory, destroying villages, and taking prisoners. From the north, the Russian Empire was actively advancing. Military fortifications such as Omsk, Semipalatinsk, Orsk, and Orenburg began to grow along the Irtysh and Yaik rivers. Formally, the Russian Empire had not yet intervened directly, but its influence in the steppe was growing stronger every year. In the south, the Qing-Chinese Empire, after subjugating the Mongols, the Manchus began to control Central Asia. This forced other nomadic peoples, the Kalmyks, Oirats, and Turkmens, to move toward the Kazakh steppe, increasing pressure on it. And now think about it. Because of overpopulation problems, the steppe could no longer feed everyone. Kazakh society still remained nomadic, and a nomadic lifestyle requires space. When the population exceeds the capacity of the pastures, conflicts begin to arise over land, water, and migration routes. The peaceful way of life was collapsing, and survival increasingly depended on the strength of arms and the ability to unite allies around oneself. By this time, the Kazakh Khanate had weakened. There was virtually no central authority. Political fragmentation, external pressure, and economic difficulties created a vacuum, and this vacuum required a strong leader. According to the commonly accepted version, Abylai Khan was born in 1711 and was given the name Abel Mansur at birth, but he came from a sultan's lineage, and this was not just a sign of nobility, but a political privilege. In Kazakh society, the title of sultan was given exclusively to the descendants of Genghis Khan through the line of Jochi, and only they had the right to claim the Khan's power. Abul Mansur belonged to this very branch. His grandfather, Abylai Jilbori Sultan, was a respected warrior and the ruler of the Sorin fortress, but it was he who dragged the family into tragedy. What happened in 1717, everything changed. The Kazakh army, under the command of Kaib Khan, suffered a heavy defeat by the Dzungars at the Ayaguz River. The losses were catastrophic, and Kaib himself returned from the battlefield with only a few warriors. The beytirs, especially from the Middle Zuz, turned away from him. He was considered a disgrace who brought shame to the entire Sultan family. Formally, Kaib Khan remained a descendant of Genghis Khan, and he could not be openly overthrown or killed. Ordinary Kazakhs did not have the right to do this, but there were also internal conflicts among the Chinggisids themselves. Then the elite unofficially gave the right of judgment and revenge specifically to Zilboris as a representative of another branch of the Sultan family. In the duel, he killed Kaib, thus breaking the taboo. A sultan, even a noble one, did not have the right to shed the Khan's blood. Such conflicts between the descendants of Genghis Khan was supposed to be resolved only through the Khan's council. The unauthorized killing of Kaib was seen as a bold violation of the established order. In this way, Zilboris put his family in danger. Their political allies turned away from them, and threats began. To avoid blood revenge and its consequences, they were forced to flee from the territory of Sredizemnoy to the territory of the Khiva Khanate, one of the most troubled regions of Central Asia. It was there, amid internal strife, tribal feuds, and Turkmen raids, that almost his entire family perished. Only little Abul Mansur survived. He was saved by his tutor and mentor named Aras Atalik. According to legend, he hid the boy under a cauldron and carried him out of the burning village. Thus began a long life under a different name. In 1724, Abul Mansur found himself in Turkestan. But even there it was not peaceful. The Dzungars continued to advance. A period began that entered Kazakh memory as the years of great disaster. Thousands of Kazakhs lost their villages, livestock, and loved ones. To protect the child, Aras and his protectors hid him with the great Talebi, one of the bywives of the senior Juz. Abul Mansur lived there for 7 years under the nickname Sabalan Sabalak, the scruffy one. Because the boy was very unkempt and looked disheveled, his origins were kept secret from everyone. He was just a simple shepherd, but the senior Biawais Batirs and wise men knew who he really was. By the age of 20, Sabalak, under this name, Abul Mansur, was still living in the steppe. He already knew how to ride a horse, handle weapons, and was well acquainted with the art of war. He still hid his origins, but his character and training, his drive for battle, could not go unnoticed. In 1733, Kazakh Batirs were once again preparing for a major campaign deep into Dzungaria, and one of the organizers was the famous commander Baganbay Batir. Sabalak decided to go with him, not as a herdsman, but as a warrior. This campaign changed his fate. When the Kazakh detachments encountered the Dzungar army, Sharish, one of the close associates of Kuntaiji Galdanseren, the ruler of Dzungaria, entered the battlefield. He was an experienced warrior and challenged the Kazakhs to a duel. According to legend, none of the Kazakh Batirs dared to step forward first. Then Sabalak stepped forward, the very same ruthless shepherd whose fighting spirit surpassed his status. He shouted the name of his grandfather, Abylai, and rushed into battle. That was the first time this name was heard on the battlefield. The duel was short. Sabalak killed Sharish, cut off his head, and, as was customary in the steppe tradition, tied it to his saddle. After that, he burst into the ranks of the Dzungars and inspired the Kazakhs to launch a decisive attack. When the battle was over, the Batirs and sultans began to ask who this young warrior was. Then he revealed his real name, Abul Mansur, grandson of Jalbaris, descendant of Juchi. Already in the following year, 1734, he was officially recognized as a sultan, and 3 clans of the Middle Jews were placed under his rule. This is how Abylai's path to the heights of power began. But the title itself did not mean authority. Real influence was given not by documents, but by military achievements, and Abylai had no shortage of those. After the tragedy of many years of great disaster, when the Dzungars captured a significant part of the territory, the steppe was in a state of permanent war. Constant clashes in the east with the Oirats, in the north with the Bashkirs and Russian Cossacks, and from the south, pressure from Central Asia. The situation required field leaders capable of quickly gathering troops, fighting back, and conducting negotiations. The formal ruler during these years was Abylmambet Khan, a descendant of Toki Khan, a respected and wise man, but he was not a military leader. He delegated military authority to Abylai. In documents from that era, Abylai is mentioned as a commander who made independent decisions in battles and negotiations. In fact, he became the commander-in-chief of the Kazakh forces in the Middle Jews. Abylai gathered the militia, distributed the forces, and personally led the troops into battle. It was he who introduced a complex game between the Russian Empire and the Dzungars, taking advantage of the fact that both sides needed his neutrality or his support. Letters from that time, preserved in Russian archives, confirm that Abylai already understood the essence of geopolitics. When the Russians tried to set him against Abulmambet, he responded with Abulmambet. For me, like a father, he did not allow external forces to use internal disagreements. It was an era of diplomacy with a saber at the belt, where only those who had been through dozens of battles could maintain peace. In these conditions, Abylai was not just strengthening his reputation, he was becoming indispensable. The main threat to the Kazakhs remained the Dzungars. It was with them that the fiercest clashes took place, especially in the area of eastern Kazakhstan along the Irtysh and Balkhash. And the battles with the Oirats, Bashkirs, and later with the Chinese Manchus became a school of survival. Abylai used tactics typical of nomadic warfare: a quick strike, withdrawal, and a new raid. He did not seek open confrontation between armies, but acted exhaustively, inflicting losses on the enemy, slipping away and returning again. This was not the romantic image of a Batir, but the calculated style of a steppe commander, and it was precisely this that allowed him to preserve the resources of the Awal and his people in conditions where the enemy was superior in numbers and technology. Abylai's victories in the 1730s and 1740s were not always recorded in the chronicles, but it was these victories that formed the aura of a leader around him, attracting not only warriors, but also ordinary people. He was becoming not just a sultan, he was becoming a symbol of hope. Around 1741, Abylai ended up in the hands of the Dzungars. This happened during a hunt when he was accompanied by only a small group. One of the Dzungar detachments suddenly attacked, captured the Sultan himself, and took him first to Tashkent and then to the headquarters of Kuntaiji Galdan. This was not just captivity, it was a diplomatic challenge. The Kazakh nobility understood that the capture of Abylai could change the balance of power, and the Russian Empire and China watched every step of the negotiations with concern. An alliance between the Dzungars and the Kazakhs, that's what frightened the empires. Abylai spent 2 years in captivity, but it was not a prison. He moved about freely, was under supervision, but not under guard. He was supervised by the Dzungar-Nayon Amursana, with whom Abylai quickly found common ground. The rapprochement between the Kazakh Sultan and the Dzungar commander caused concern far beyond the steppe. The Russian administration hurriedly sent letters to the Khan's headquarters, trying to disrupt a possible alliance. In St. Petersburg, they understood that if the two nomadic states united, the southern borders of the Russian Empire would be under threat. In 1743, the Kazakh delegation succeeded in securing Abylai's release. In exchange, another amanat, that is, a hostage, Abul Fais, the son of Abul Mbambet, was sent to Dzungaria. It was a compromise. Honor was preserved, the alliance was not formed, and the balance was temporarily restored. But this episode became a turning point. Abylai returned not only as a survivor of captivity, but also as a man who managed to endure hardships, preserve his dignity, and even establish relations with the enemy. For the Kazakhs, this was a sign. Such a leader is worth listening to. In 1745, Galdan Saren Kuntaiji, the last strong ruler of Dzungaria, died, and his death led to an internal struggle for power. His son, Lama Dorji, tried to inherit the throne, but he had neither authority nor support. A civil war began. One of the contenders was Amursana, the very same Dzungar Noyon under whose care Abylai spent 2 years in captivity, Amursana. He was ambitious, intelligent, and warlike. But the main problem was that he did not come from the main branch of the Khan's lineage. Influential Oirat commanders opposed him. Turmoil was tearing Dzungaria apart. Many Naimans sided with Abylai or sought support from China. No one was able to hold on to power. It was at this time that Kazakh detachments began to reclaim the lands that had been seized during the Great Disaster. Dzungaria was losing territory and influence. In 1755, Amursana fled to China and asked for military assistance. The Chinese Empire used this as a pretext for intervention. Chinese troops invaded Dzungaria, officially to put Amursana on the throne, but in reality to destroy the state itself. Kazakh lands found themselves dangerously close to the Manchu armies. In the autumn of 1756, Amursana, realizing that he had become a pawn in someone else's game, fled again, this time to Abylai. King detachments were following him. This is how the Kazakh-Chinese border war began. In the spring of 1756, the Chinese army crossed the border and began an offensive into the territory of the Middle Jutes. The Kazakh forces under the command of Abylai did not engage in direct confrontation, but used tactics typical for nomads: quick strikes, withdrawal, and flanking raids. At first they suffered significant losses, but by autumn the situation began to change. In a series of battles that lasted until October, Kazakh detachments were able to stop the advance of the Chinese corps. Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan. That was not the goal. The Chinese retreated, and there was no further invasion. This battle became a symbol for the Kazakhs that even in the face of the enemy's numerical and technical superiority, the steppe could still defend itself. By the 1770s, the name Abylai was known not only in the steppe, but also beyond its borders. He fought, negotiated, and held back both the Chinese and the Russians, while formally remaining only the Sultan of the Middle Juz. He was not yet the absolute Khan of the entire steppe. Everything changed. Then an event occurred known as the Dusty Campaign. Thousands of Kalmyks living in the Volga region decided to return east, back to Dzungaria, which by that time was already under the rule of the Manchu Empire, the Qing. About 35,000 families set out on their journey in winter, crossing the lands of the Kazakhs. On the way, the Kalmyks faced resistance. They were attacked by Bashkirs, Russian Cossacks, and a Kazakh detachment. Many people died, some managed to migrate, but many were left behind in the steppe. Kazakh lands found themselves at the epicenter of the movement of people, livestock, and military clashes. Against the backdrop of this instability and the threat of new conflicts, the Kazakh nobility keenly realized the need for a unified authority. Soon after that, Senior Khan Abulmambet passed away. There was no longer a united headquarters, and all eyes turned to Abylai, the only leader who possessed real authority and military power. Abylai, who united the three Zhuzes, restored the alliance with the Karakalpaks, Kyrgyz, and the tribes of Khorasan and Tashkent. This was not just a political act, it was the return of the ideas of Kazakh statehood. By the time he was elected Khan, Abylai understood perfectly well that the steppe could no longer exist outside of geopolitics. On one side was the Russian Empire, actively advancing through the Yaik, Irtish, and Orenburg lines. On the other side was China, which had destroyed Dzungaria and established itself in the Astana region. Between them, Kazakh lands were caught as if in a vice. Abylai chose a course that would later be called a policy of maneuvering. He officially recognized the suzerainty of both empires, but only within the realm of diplomacy. There was no real dependence. To the Russians, he presented himself as a vassal, to the Chinese as a submissive tributary, but in reality he remained an independent ruler. He sent embassies to both St. Petersburg and Beijing, corresponded with the Orenburg administration, and at the same time sent his people to China. The Chinese recognized him as the leader of the border peoples, while the Russian Empire in turn sought to formalize his subordination, but encountered polite evasion. Abylai understood that if he relied on only one empire, the other would swallow the steppe, but if he played their interests against each other, he could preserve autonomy. And as long as Beijing and Petersburg couldn't come to an agreement with each other, he maintained control over internal affairs. Legends depict Abylai as the ideal steppe ruler, brave, intelligent, and just, but real sources provide a much more nuanced portrait. He was cautious, sometimes harsh, but knew how to wait, spoke little but precisely and at the right moment, could act tough, and no one doubted his right to do so. Abylai ended his reign in relative peace. He no longer took part in major military campaigns, but continued to resolve disputes between clans, sent embassies, and kept watch over the borders. These were years of stabilization. Rare for the 18th century, he maintained actual control over the Middle Zhuz and influence over the other Zhuzes. The Russian Empire tried to increase administrative pressure, while China sought to establish control. Through symbolic gestures, Abylai maneuvered until the end, not allowing either empire to interfere in internal politics. In his later years, he gradually began to bring his descendants onto the political stage. Among them was Vali Khan, to whom he delegated authority in the Middle Zhuz. Abylai himself focused on strengthening internal order. Abylai Khan died in 1781, most likely at the age of about 70. According to tradition, he was buried in Turkestan in the mausoleum of Kadzi Ahmed Yasavi, the same place where he was once proclaimed Khan Abylai. It is sacred not only for his lineage, but also for the entire Kazakh history. With his death, the era of unity came to an end. Abylai had, according to various sources, between 12 and 14 wives and several dozen children. Many of them became sultans, and some continued the struggle for independence. His most famous descendants were his son Vali Khan and his grandson Kenesari Khan, the last great fighter for Kazakh statehood. For Kazakhs, Abylai is not just a historical figure. He is a pillar, a symbol of unity, mature diplomacy, and cautious strength. He was not overly pompous, but he had a sense of proportion, a sense of timing, and a sense of responsibility. Abylai Khan was the one who held the steppe together on the verge of collapse and gave future generations a chance to remain themselves. That's all from me. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye, everyone.